Today's topic is advancing climate justice to promote health equity. And our speaker is Adrienne Hampton. And she's got a lot of qualifications, and she's been on a lot of committees and work task force. But I'm going to summarize the most important ones. Adrienne will address in this talk how these disproportional affectations to the poor and the people of color came about, and what can be done to promote fairness and justice in climate and public health policies. Adrienne graduated from the University of Washington Evans School of Public Policy and Governance with her Master's of Public Administration degree just a few years ago. Her background and career are based on ocean climate action, equity, and racial justice. And I think, Adrienne, you're going to tell us about the Duwamish, some of the rest. I'm glad about that. Adrienne, I'm going to turn the program over to you right now.
Thank you so much, Jill, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really a joy to be invited to this space. So I am so grateful that you decided to spend your next, hour listening to everything that I have to offer today. Yes, my name is Adrienne. I use she, her pronouns, and just a little bit more on the personal side. I grew up in Rochester, New York, so upstate New York. And in that area, the church across from the hospital I was born in, had a secret passage for those who were traveling through the Underground Railroad. In my when I was a little bit older, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I got my roots for organizing and policy, and really social justice has been embedded in my family for generations. I remember hanging out with my grandma, her having her own, living room kind of solutions-based chats, with all of her neighbors, trying to figure out how they can make a world a better place. And so these topics are near and dear to my heart. And today I am going to be sharing my screen. So hopefully that comes up for you well, and that you can see that okay. And then in addition, I am going to take us through pretty much like a 3-part series, and there'll be lots of opportunities to use a couple of virtual tools that I'm really excited to share with you today. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in. So let me just get my screen adjusted here, and hopefully everyone can see and hear me okay. And if not, just let me know. I used to teach online courses at the University of Washington for an environmental studies program. So I feel like I can handle this pretty well, and I'm also monitoring the chat. Feel free to drop any questions you might have in that chat space, or just keep a pen and piece of paper next to you and jot down your thoughts there. And then we will, have a conversation towards the end of this discussion. Okay. So with that, again, for those who may have just hopped on, my name is Adrienne. I use she, her pronouns. Today, I'm calling in from the traditional homelands of the Suquamish tribe and the Duwamish peoples, who I owe much to their stewardship since time immemorial, present and future. And I just recognize that I'm a highly appreciative guest in this place, and I strive to become a better guest every day among such beautiful lands, air, and water. So again, thanks so much for having me. So for part 1, we're going to talk about really the conversation today. I'm hoping to explore just a couple of questions and problem statements or issue areas, if you will. And I'm really looking forward to exploring these ideas together. And so some of us may be very informed or have a good idea of what's going on in these spaces. And so I just invite us to all kind of walk through this journey together. And so in that way, we're going to be exploring the following things. So first and foremost, I think that it's really important to think about racial equity at the intersection of the environmental movement. It's actually something that is, in my experience, a little bit underlooked, and we need to do better about it. And we can look at this through thinking about biodiversity conservation. So that's like the biodiversity and richness of our species at the intersection of power, right? Like who holds what power, how much, and is that shared? We can also look at this through the lens of privilege and identity, and especially thinking about identities that aren't always represented in the field. And so this throughout this talk, we're going to be exploring, reflecting on the legacies in which environmental racism exists within policy, because we can't talk about justice until we examine and do some analysis around that first. And then we'll talk about how this looks when we apply action-based solutions. So those will be our three parts. So to set the tone, we're going to kind of use these next two slides to kind of help shape our thinking, and like the lens, right? The photo, when we're taking a picture, like the lens we're going to be looking through while we're talking about these things. So keep these in mind. The first is this three nested model. You may have seen this in the past, but pretty much this is the idea that everything is nested in our environment, right? So without our environment, many of the things we love and the people we love would not exist. And so our society is embedded in the environment, and our economy is nested in our environment. And this is so important to remind ourselves that everything is a gift from the land, right? And in this way, we are not separate from it. We all are not separate from it. So keep that in mind. We'll also try to tackle and unpack these two problem statements. So first, that there's a lack in representation in two main areas. Number one, the mainstream environmental movement, and two, in the decision-making spaces. So that's like within our local government, within our state government, and also in our federal government as well. And in my opinion, these two things leave us with a lot of work to do ahead of us, especially when talking about how to tackle the climate crisis. So all that being said, we're now going to move into part two, and we're going to try to unpack, how did we get here? Why is this? And to do this, I'm going to encourage us to apply what I like to call turn the curve thinking. So there's a curve behind almost everything, right? Why is it getting hotter? Or why might the water level be rising, right? And there's a curve behind that. And so to understand this, and understand how we're going to apply our turn the curve thinking, we must first understand the story behind the curve, right? What's everything that's adding up? And we need to do this in order to then course correct the problem or situation in order to then turn the curve. Okay, so in order to do that, we need to go through our analysis. So right now, for the next couple of minutes, we're going to go through an analysis of how we got here, right? Why do we sometimes think of I'm not saying that we on this call, but it's often that our society functions apart from the environment. And then we can also ask ourselves, why do we see these gaps in underrepresented identities, not only in the environmental field, but also our decision-making spaces? So I'm going to walk us through a timeline, and we're going to start in 1851. And so we're going to walk through and draw these parallels through a couple case studies and then connect it all together. Okay, so I first wanted to show everyone this really important map. So this is an 1850s rendering of, we're now looking more across the water at the Seattle region. And this map was done by the Berkelen Museum in partnership with many excellent entities to come up with this rendering, and it's called the Waterlines Map. You can look this one up online, and there's also a couple stories paired with it. But I wanted to show us this to kind of set a baseline of like, where did we start? So in 1851, we see this is pretty much, for those who are familiar, this Seattle waterfront. And then these mudflats are these vast tidal mudflats that sit below 15 miles of meandering river, which today we know as the Duwamish River. And I'll go into that in a little bit. So our city is built on Indigenous land and the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, like the Suquamish and Duwamish peoples. Oops, sorry. And so in 1851, European American immigrants, when they arrived, I hear this is also something that you may have been talking about today, arrived at Alki Point near the Duwamish head of what we know now as West Seattle over in this area. So in this era, not only do we see a changing of the Seattle region, but in this era, we also saw the establishment of some of the first national parks, right? And while that was happening, we also experienced the erasure and movement of indigenous cultures and peoples across the US. So in this way, while we were establishing the national parks and the preservation of land, we were also starting to reshape a relationship with nature and whom belonged in these places. You might also recall that later down the timeline in 1871, there was also the terror of Jim Crow about. That's why I have this Margaret Walker quote right here from For My People. The quote reads, "Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty fall of healing and a strength of final clenching and the pulsing in our spirits and blood." So even in the light of in the haze of oppression and exclusion, we still saw a perseverance and an overcoming. And so um, nearing, I want to say like 1940, 1960, the Seattle area also saw an increase in the African American population, making the community the city's largest underserved group. And as the Black community moved from north to west during and after World War II in search of employment and new opportunities, all of the city's minority groups experienced some form of discrimination, and we see the legacy of that in the area today. So this includes geographic segregation, employment inequality, and housing discrimination. And until 1968, apologies, it was legal to discriminate against minorities in Seattle when renting apartments or selling real estate, for example. So let's move on. So now we're at 1964, and I call out this important date because, as you may recall, this was the same year in which both the Wilderness Act and the Civil Rights Act came to be. And I think that in a way, this was almost an opportunity missed looking back. And so stick with me. So you have two pieces of landmark legislation. And now this is where we start to think about um, representation in decision making and why might we have gaps in underrepresented identities, not only in natural spaces, but in the mainstream environmental movement. And so the Wilderness Act and Civil Rights Act, um, they're closer than I believe we often give them credit for. And so in looking back at their roots to see the intimate ties between race and people, the Wilderness Act was very much about protecting the wild, right, from the spoilage of humans and human impact, versus kind of creating and opening equitable access into it so everyone can experience all the benefits of nature. So instead of accessibility and thinking about equitable access to place and the benefits of nature, the Wilderness Act was focused on this kind of like pure, right? We can unpack that maybe at a later time. And while this conversation was happening across the aisle, you have folks like the NAACP fighting for the civil rights, fighting for the Civil Rights Act. And so I always wonder, like, what would happen if actually the Civil Rights Act and the Wilderness Act were written together in two? You know, the NAACP was not invited across the aisle to talk about the Wilderness Act, right? They were not invited to participate in that conversation, thus not invited in to think about the protection of place and people. So while one was fighting for the protection of people, the other was fighting for the protection of place. And I think this impacts the framing of the mainstream environmental movement today. So the ethical horizons both acts sought to broaden are still ours to reach. And I'll leave you with this quote by um, a good friend of mine, but also an author I truly admire who wrote Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African American Communities to the Great Outdoors. Carolyn Finney wrote, had the Wilderness Act considered the human experience in nature, the traditional conservation movement might not struggle with the understanding that the connection between its work and that of civil rights, making it better to equip better equipped to engage with the issues related to diversity and inclusion. Okay, now we're going to hit pause and we're gonna now walk into 1980. And I would love to share a video with you.
Small, predominantly African American community in eastern North Carolina called Warren County. African Americans and white activists joined together in protest in what's described as a merger of civil rights and environmentalism.
The whole environmental justice movement as a movement really took off in Warren County because this was a case study where people basically drew a line in the dirt and said no more.
For nearly 4 years, the residents of Warren County have been protesting the state of North Carolina's plan to transport PCB-contaminated soil to a landfill in their community. When the trucks began to roll, angered residents decided they'd had enough, and in a nonviolent act of civil disobedience, they blocked the road.
Here you had primarily a lot of African American women and their children who literally laid down in the streets to block the trucks from dumping polychlorinated biphenyls, PCB, in a toxic waste landfill in their community. And here's an agricultural community where the aquifer level is very shallow near the surface, where most people have wells, get their drinking water from wells. And the thought that the state would pick this county of all of the 100 counties in North Carolina as a dumping site was just unthinkable.
The Warren County incident triggered a whole series of investigations into the relationship between race and toxics. In 1983, the General Accounting Office examined the placement of off-site commercial hazardous waste landfills in 8 states in the Southeast. What they found was that 3 out of 4 were located in predominantly poor and African American communities, in a region where African Americans comprise only 20% of the population.
Now, that's disproportionate impact. That is not a random distribution. In other words, you're only 20% of the population, but 3 out of 4 of the landfills. And that's the first government study that actually documented this particular pattern.
In 1987, the United Church of Christ's Commission on Racial Justice issued its first report on toxic wastes and race in the U.S. The report's findings stirred up a big national debate about the relationship between where people live, the race of those communities, and the location of the toxic waste facilities.
And what the 1987 report did was it verified, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that in terms of the location of toxic waste facilities, those are commercial, licensed, and those uncontrolled sites, those that are not licensed, you find an overwhelmingly disproportionate amount of these facilities in African American communities, in Latino American communities, and other people of color communities.
The report concluded that 3 out of every 5 Hispanic and African Americans lived in areas with uncontrolled toxic waste sites. Reverend Ben Chavis, executive director of the commission at that time, coined this phenomenon, environmental racism.
Environmental racism is racial discrimination in environmental policymaking. It is the deliberate targeting of racial and ethnic communities for environmental facilities, hazard facilities like toxic waste landfills, incinerators. It is also the disproportionate presence of point generation sources of toxins like petrochemical facilities.
In 1992, the National Law Journal released the findings of its own investigation.
One of the things that became really clear to us in our data was that polluters in white communities get higher penalties for violating the law than polluters in minority communities. And that is not the case if you compare high-income and low-income areas. Their penalties are virtually the same.
The study also found that the government had taken longer to address hazards in Superfund sites located in minority communities and accepted less stringent cleanup plans.
I think once people find out what the real dangers of environmental injustice are and there are a lot of dangers, people will really get involved. Because we often say that the issue of environmental racism is an issue of life and death.
County.
All right.
But to also and because I love PBS, but to also kind of continue and support this story of how we got here. And so connecting that video with what we were just talking about, the conversation then shifts to protection of place, but we're not protecting all people at the same time. And thus, with a lack in representation and decision making, for someone to say, where's the waste going to go? If you don't have a diverse set of voices at the table, then we might see disproportionate impact, right? And so we see that today. And so the video talks about how environmental racism and a lack of representation in decision-making spaces to create positive solutions is actually harming our communities. And we do see this today in the Duwamish Valley. So 1880 to today, you might remember I showed you in the beginning this map, right? And today, that same area is the Duwamish Valley. So you might see the differences here you see lots more kind of land use. You see that the river looks different, and this is truly a transformation. And we also know that this has had severe impacts on the community which lives there. And so a recent study in 2016 and this year showed that the neighborhoods of South Park and Georgetown in the Duwamish Valley, which we were just looking, compared to Laurelhurst in Northeast Seattle, which is a more affluent community, there's actually about a 13-year life expectancy difference. And that's about within, 10 miles here. So we see that's a severe repercussion of having a lack of diversity in decision making and not in thinking about protection of people and place. Okay, so we're going to keep moving. And now today. So through this timeline, I hope we have done a review and analysis of how do we get to where we are today and trying to prep some of the conversation. And now we're in 2021. So I just wanted to use this one study to kind of wrap us up here along our timeline in our analysis. And this is with a theory called the luxury effect, heavily researched by Christopher Scheel at the University of Washington, Tacoma, who did this incredible research. But this lab looked at the ecological and evolutionary consequences of systematic racism in urban environments and how our wildlife and our biodiversity and species is actually adapting and moving with that way of doing. And so, for example, several studies have showed, and the authors have proven that fewer trees in low income and racially minoritized neighborhoods in major U.S. cities across the U.S. This means that not only is there a higher temperature, but we see less species, right? Less birds, less, less robust ecological systems. And these areas also tend to be closer to industrial waste and or dumping sites compared to wealthier, predominantly white areas, like we heard in the video. And so this photo shows an illustration of how structural inequalities in cities can have a profound impact on the urban landscape, including urban heat islands, green space cover, tree cover, environmental pollutants, and resource distribution, as well as disease dynamics. And so with this, I'm going to leave our analysis off on this one quote. And that's kind of like, what do we do about this? And so this is one of my favorite quotes, 1955 from Martin Luther King Jr., that we are determined to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. And so knowing that we still have these not only health disparities, in our same area, but we also see this lack of representation in decision making. We can ask ourselves, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to apply that turn the curve thinking? And so I take us to part 3, action-oriented solutions. And I'm going to tell this through my own work, working with the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition. So we are a coalition working to promote health equity. And there's a few partners that make up our coalition. And so to orient us, we're come back to this map that I showed you. And so, the Duwamish River and the land around it have a rich history, and it has been a central part of what now is South Seattle's ecosystem for thousands of years. And here's the Duwamish Valley, a resilient community. So right here in this orange box is the river and that map that we keep coming back to. And here is what that river looks like today. So in your observations, you might notice heavy industry, right? You might see large container trucks, or container ship, cargo and handling. This is the Port of Seattle, and we also have large facilities like Ash Grove Cement, Seattle Iron and Metal, as well as just a lot of industry facilities. And so you might see from these photos, lack of trees, lack of, robust ecological systems, and those kind of buffers that we know we need to not only like clean our air, but to keep the system healthy for the humans who live there. So we represent one river, one community, one home, and there is only one river in Seattle, and that's the Duwamish River. And so the Duwamish Valley needs all of us working together for a better future. And due to these the complex legacy of environmental racism in the Duwamish Valley, building community resilience through things like community ownership, right? Who owns that land? Who has a say in what gets to be built there? Is it affordable housing, or is it like a grocery store? What about decision making and power building? Is the community ready to mobilize and act if something is happening within their backyard that they don't like? And we can also think about how it's imperative to establish equitable safeguards, policies that are going to work to protect people who are most impacted, for a resilient future. And here's a quote from a community member that I just love, and I'll read it out loud. It says, "I earn my living close to home, and the river is a central part of my home and job. Along with my brothers and sisters on the waterfront, my health depends on a clean and safe place to work, which means we have to take care of the river and the spaces around it. My family and the next generation's future depends on preserving our common cultural and economic place that is the Duwamish." So I'm just going to walk us through a couple examples of what's going on here, with the time that we have. And this will be told through our mission. So we work to elevate the voices by those most impacted by the Duwamish River pollution and other environmental injustices to advocate for a clean, healthy, and equitable environment for people and wildlife. We promote placekeeping and prioritize community capacity and empowerment. And this is so important because of that one very sobering fact that I shared with you earlier, is that folks in this community, life expectancy is 13 years shorter compared to more affluent communities in the rest of Seattle. So what are we going to do about that? Well, first, we should talk about the Superfund site. And then this will probably be our main example for today. And again, there's only one river. And so the Duwamish Cleanup Coalition, or DRCC, in which I work, we help provide technical advisory and understanding to what is happening, not only with the Superfund, but the Superfund cleanup. So the river has to be cleaned up. And so we not only work to deliver information, but build community power around this. So we have a goal of cleaning up the river, and that includes source control of stormwater, and other kind of potentially hazardous like runoff, as well as community involvement. And we also know that the same polluters that have led to the Superfund site are also the same emitters that are contributing to our climate crisis. So I thought it'd be fun to take you all to the river. So I'm going to again try to, I'm going to switch my screen and bring us to this virtual tool. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
I'm seeing some head nods. Okay, great. So now we're on the Duwamish River. How exciting. We started in 1850 and now we're on the river today. And so what you're looking at here is the West Seattle Bridge. I'm just going to turn us around. So this is what you would experience if you were on a boat going down the river. I'm just going to take us to 3 important sites, and we're just going to kind of run through these. Okay, so I'm going to keep kind of turning us around, but the first thing I like to show off on the river is these 2 little garages. I'm going to try to get us closer, and those garages are what you call a CSO, or combined sewer overflow. So this CSO in particular drains 30 square miles of stormwater from South Capitol Hill, from I-90, all the way down towards Seaward Park and everything in between, as stormwater goes into the river. And so CSO stands for Combined Sewer Overflow. Sorry, I said the wrong name beforehand. But this means that we have a combined sewage system in Seattle. So both rain and sewage go into the same system. And so when it rains hard, which it does often, the overflow will come into places like this, the Duwamish River. And this is not just sewage from the drains and your toilets, but also industrial sewage that may or may not be treated as well. So this kind of gives us a sense of what's entering the river and what and what kind of things we might need to keep in mind for the future when we're cleaning it up. So now we're going to kind of keep going along the river here using this tool. And the next place I like to point out to folks is an area called Seattle Iron and Metal. And I like to use this example because visually, I think it's one of the more shocking areas on the river as far as when we talk about pollution along the river and what communities also living next to. So this is Seattle and Iron and Metals. And while the task of recycling is incredibly important, this area, while it may have been state of the art back in the day, today is a problem area on the river. So there's an all-purpose grader located on the river, and Seattle and Iron Metals is one of the biggest polluters in the Puget Sound. And so this is due to the release of not only the metals from the cars, but the fluff, right? And so this was one where Puget Sound actually recently won a settlement that has forced them to make greater improvements so that not only are their contaminants no longer falling on the surface waters, but that's harmful air pollution that community is breathing in. And so we see that while there aren't the best practices happening along the river, there's also mechanisms to hold people accountable and to clean it up. And I'll end on this site, which is Boeing plant number 2, I believe. And so Boeing was one of the largest cleanups along the river, but also one of the most successful early action sites that was cleaned up. And so Boeing did a great job with this restoration. You can tell that compared to the other two that we saw, it looks more earthy, right? There's a restored shoreline. And this is the kind of thing that we are looking for when we're talking about cleaning up the river. Imagine, which one would you rather live next to? And so in this way, this work wouldn't have been done if it wasn't for major community involvement and community being involved in the decision making, right? At what point do you want the levels and the toxicity to be cleaned up out of the river? So this is something that was really important as far as community involvement. So when we think about who's impacted the most by our decisions or by what we place in a neighborhood, it's imperative that those voices are represented at the table, and not just to warm seats, but to be heard and have their recommendations prioritized in the decision making. That is how I believe we get amazing results such as these. A story on the street is that this cleanup went so well that the communities delivered cookies to the site manager, who did an excellent job. And so we do see the river coming back, which is amazing, but we do know that we have a long way to go. So I'm going to switch again and bring us back to the PowerPoint, and we're almost done here. Trying to cover a lot of ground. And so the cleanup is supposed to be wrapping up around 2027, but we also know that long-term monitoring will also be needed. And right now, I thought we could end on an action item in which we all have a say. So there is currently an update on the cleanup, and it is kind of a tad confusing to explain. But earlier when we were watching the video on environmental justice, the PBS video, they talked about certain cancer-causing agents and chemicals. And we also know that those toxins are found in the Duwamish River. And so currently, there is a comment period where the EPA is asking people what they think about their proposed changes. And this is called a proposed explanation of significant differences. And what this means is that because the EPA is basically in charge of cleaning up the Superfund site, it has to do a public comment for any changes that are made. This map on the right-hand side shows where these cancer-causing agents actually show up in the river. So you can tell by the colorful map that they are kind of everywhere. And so the change that the EPA is proposing is a change in the levels of CPAHs and BAPs that would actually be cleaned up from the river. So new research has shown that the health impacts are essentially not as bad as they thought they were before. And so with that, they're proposing to lower the level of what would actually be cleaned up out of the river. And so in this way, we have an opportunity to comment and tell the EPA what we think about that. And I'll share the opinion from DRCC. So based upon our technical analysis and given the cancer risks of these BPHs, we understand that while we just basically understand that this area might be understudied, and not only just for the Duwamish River, but the future of all Superfund site cleanups. We need to not only think about the human impact, right? Like what our health of the river, but what about our clams and the wildlife and other things that are within the ecosystem that absorb these chemicals, and thus fishers on the river, might want to eat. And so we need to, again, here is another case where we need to think about a holistic system and how to protect both place and people. And so we're concerned that the revised CPH sediment cleanup, those cancer-causing agents, may impact clam tissues as various levels in other chemicals and sediments dissolve into the water column and change water quality. So we just believe that this must be recovered to the standards that support our community and fishing for generations. Okay, so I'm at 12:30, but we're close to wrapping up here. And I just want to say that we continue to work together to face these systemic inequities. And I think a really good example of that is our nearby Duwamish River, our Superfund site. And also to prioritize local voices in the discussion of these cleanup efforts as these communities are disproportionately impacted. And then looking forward, I just wanted to give you a sneak preview of things to come. We're thinking about climate change a lot. The Duwamish Valley area is kind of like a bathtub, and so 90% of the expected sea level rise will happen in the Duwamish Valley. So imagine sea level rise plus a Superfund site. So I don't know about you, but I definitely don't want Superfund site toxins flooding in to our homes, because we do know that folks live along the river. So it's imperative that we also think about not only the river cleanup, but impacts to come that may expose community to hazardous contamination and water quality impacts. So we are thinking about climate justice using these 4 key principles. I'll just run through them quickly. That includes clean and safe environment, so making sure that no one is in close proximity to hazardous waste. We focus on placekeeping, so how can we make sure that we can clean up an area but keep people there and preserve cultural vibrancy. We know that gentrification is a major issue in the Seattle area, but we also know that during hard times like a pandemic, being close to your family unit is really important for mutual aid. And so we need to make sure that folks can stay rooted while the environment around them is being cleaned up. And then I'll just couple these two together. So growing meaningful involvement, involving the youth in these kind of opportunities, as well as encouraging our decision makers to prioritize the voices of those most impacted by these really serious issues. And so with that, we might, approach a more just world. This is how we can together start advancing climate justice. And that justice component is really important because that means that we are eliminating the disproportionate impact, right? And the existing health inequities. And then just because this is so cool, I can't help but show it. But a cool way of this all kind of coming together, not only representation in the environmental movement, but increasing involvement in decision making, is the youth-led moss study. So we partnered with the Forest Service and other partners from our Clean Air Stakeholders Program, and we got the youth involved. And so the youth went out and collected 80 samples of moss. And moss is really interesting because it actually acts as an air monitor. So you can study heavy metals and toxins using moss. And so the youth collected samples, and so did the Forest Service. And with that, we came up with scientific data that showed the hazardous metals that exist in the air. And you may know that we're thinking about who the culprit might be, is that Seattle Iron and Metals that's located along the river. But in this way, not only were we able to grow meaningful involvement, getting the youth involved, but we were able to use this data for future decision making of what we're going to do about this problem in order to turn the curve, right? Course correct poor air quality and these poor practices that harm our health. In addition, we can use this research to also target problem locations so we can make sure that folks eventually down the road experience less exposure to these harmful toxins. So in just as one example, we kind of see this action-based solutions and how we can start to turn the curve on the legacies of environmental racism that have been passed down through generations. And so we will continue this work, and I hope you all enjoyed this chat. I will just leave this slide here and I'll put my email in the chat. But with that, I wrap up, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. It was lovely. And I'm going to start with 2 questions, and then people can put it in the chat. But I'll tell you, we are a small enough group so people can just speak their own questions. I'm not going to monitor the chat. And when you have try to moderate yourself so everybody doesn't speak at the same time. On the other hand, you can put it in the chat and I'll read it. But one, I was impressed with how absolutely dirty it was, how horrible it looks. Whereas you'd expect on a bank to have, a bank, all that rocks and crummy stuff and everything bad. How long it took to completely destroy it, and all those decisions that were taken without thinking about any future. I'm just impressed with that. And I'm so glad you're doing the work, because it seems to me it's going to take a long time to reverse it. One specific question I had is, who decides? I think any level of the PCBs and the other toxins that you mentioned really have a bad effect via epigenetics and via bad health to children particularly, and bad outcomes for their mental abilities when you have almost any toxins in the soil or in the air. So who decides these levels? And I'll just say, I think that almost all of them are too low, because there's that thing of concentration, like you said, with the crustaceans, with the moss, also eating this one and that one. So when you get up, I know that the orcas now and many of the harbor seals are getting cancer because they accumulate all the toxins. So can you speak to either one of these, that who decides, and
Sure.
Can we make it lower even?
Sure. So excellent question. Thank you so much. I'll just I'll back up and just acknowledge, yes, the river is very dirty, and this is, I think, just a sobering reminder that's also in our backyards, and it's almost hidden unless you are on the river seeing it from the river's view. And so I think even that right there tells us a lot about how we also keep these issues hidden, and if you aren't looking for them, you might not see them. Right. There are more than 40 toxic chemicals in the sediment actually within the river's bottom that needs to be cleaned up to make sure we're protecting the environment and the people, to your point, Jill. And so this includes eating seafood, other health risks, and thinking about cumulative impact. I'm so glad you brought that up. And so zooming out and thinking about the big picture, Washington State doesn't do the best job about thinking about cumulative impact. For example, in one area, you can have really big, emitting facilities, whether they're emitting greenhouse gases or what have you. They all have their permits that say you can emit this much. And so while they all might be operating at what their permits say to do, we think about them as a separate entity, not all of them added up together. And so while one entity might not be emitting to what their permit says, when you add them all up, that cumulative equation might actually say that everyone's emitting too much. And so we can think about that when we're talking about the Superfund cleanup. So the EPA, to your question, Jill, decides the levels. And so I believe that the EPA has like a toxics committee that gets together, and, they're highly qualified. They're, actually extremely prestigious like individuals that look at the best available science and kind of think about these levels. And so I think, to my knowledge, there is a naturally occurring level of something like PCBs in our environment. And it brings up a lot of really interesting ethical questions, right? Like, what is a tolerable threshold, or what is an acceptable threshold of these toxins, right, in our soil, in our river? And that, I think that's a lot to chew on, right? Because we want to say there should be none. And so that's something that the EPA decides, but the people have the power to demand better standards, also, to your point, Jill. And so this comment period, to let the EPA know what you think is an important opportunity to basically say that these standards need to be to the highest levels that they can be, to ensure that this river not only will be cleaned up but can stay that way. And so I guess I'll pause there. Did I answer everything, Jill?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any more questions? And you can unmute yourself. And
yeah, I was wondering, well, I've got several questions, but I watched something about flame retardants, the PFACs or something like that. And the dust from them is toxic. It causes, it's harmful for kids and developing fetuses and all.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anything about PFACs?
I can't speak specifically to the issue, but what I will say is that, so there are certain, I'm going to call them PAHs.
Oh, okay.
But there's a couple of them, and long-term exposure, we know, can also increase the risk of cancer and other diseases like you're talking about, and those are carcinogenic. And it is amazing how these things are, in our soil and dust. And there's actually an area in which community calls like the Dust Bowl. The issue of like figuring out where these things are coming from and why they're there in the first place is really hard to do, because, believe it or not, there actually isn't a robust air quality network within the Duwamish Valley. And that is a huge issue, because in that way, we can't really pinpoint and say what is going on. We know who's there, we know who's emitting, but as far as like how much and to what degree, it's kind of tricky, because the air monitors, you can monitor for PM, that's like various particulate matter, but when you're looking for like various toxins and like metals, all these monitors pick up different like sources, and that can get expensive really, really fast. And so we're pushing now for a more robust air quality network system, but it's just incredibly expensive, so no one wants to do it. And so we can't start answering those questions, right, until we have the infrastructure to really understand what is happening. And that's really critical, because sometimes I ask myself, well, why weren't they put there in the first place, right? Is it because no one wants to know the answer, or is it easier not to know the answer? So I'll just leave that open-ended.
Would PFACs be included in the comment period? Are they included in that type of pollutant that we're commenting about?
To my knowledge,
in that class,
I'm not sure. I would have to look at the list of the 40 chemicals or 40 toxins that they're looking at for that cleanup level. This is specifically for the PAHs that are considered to, or sorry, the CPHs that are considered to be the most toxic, but not as toxic as previously thought. And so I think what your point, it would relate more to kind of our air quality and air pollution reduction measures.
Well, it gets in water and dust. So
Right. And this is another point of why having these really robust and unique partnerships is really fun. So I mentioned Puget Sound Keeper before. And so sometimes we join Puget Sound Keeper Alliance in air quality projects, because not only is it in the air, but it falls onto the river and then becomes a surface water issue under the Clean Water Act.
You know, I'm going to say again that I think almost any level is harmful. I was just calculating, it was about 45 years ago, I was in a public health lab and we were measuring levels of lead. That was the big deal then. They just started lead testing for school children because they saw that almost any level of lead makes them less able to learn. And it was in the, it was racially discrepant also, because a lot of the older houses where non-whites lived, that all the paint was still lead paint and children would get it through that way, or the schools, that kind of thing. So, and they've shown more and more that it might not have cancer, make you have cancer. It might not kill you, but these low levels really do affect cognition. And then they go and test people with standardized testing. And they say certain school districts don't do as well as other school districts. And you just can put a map of toxins over there and you can see exactly the school districts that don't do as well on tests are those ones that have a lot of toxins. So, I mean, I find it very non-truthful how people don't admit how much toxins affect cognition in children particularly.
I have another question about legislation in the state legislature. Did you see that the Tree Island urban forestry bill passed to plant trees in urban areas?
Exactly. Yes. Very exciting and very important. And also thinking about what are the best trees to plant is also a really neat conversation. Various trees have the ability to kind of absorb and purify the air, I guess more effectively or efficiently than other species. And so I'm excited to see what that conversation brings up. So yeah, very exciting.
Rowan, do you want to say something about that? Rowan's job.
That's a personal interest of mine. I work with forest restoration, and I actually work with Seattle Parks and Rec quite a bit. So I don't know if you already work with them, if you know Michael Yadrick at all. Yes, it is super interesting. And there's also an interesting conversation that you might have maybe an opinion on around assisted migration right now of different tree species, whether to plant tree species that are long-term native to the area and to the ecology of the area versus bringing in tree species that might be adapted to a future climate that might not traditionally be part of the native ecology. Is that a conversation that you're having or that you've heard?
That's one that hasn't really crossed our sphere because we're still fighting for the trees to begin with to actually get them there. So hopefully once we kind of secure, increasing green space and improving outdoor air quality through, physical and these environmental changes, then we can also have that conversation.
Well, I think are there any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to thank Adrienne Hampton.
I have one more.
Sure, go ahead.
Sure.
If it's okay, are there any other well, I have two more. Any other legislation that's passed that you're happy about?
So I will mention it's not quite passed, but it is so close, and that is our HEAL Act. So it's the Healthy Environment for All Act. And this act is so incredibly significant and one we've been working on for a really long time because it requires the state agencies to employ and follow a definition of environmental justice in their decision making. And this is something that is just really significant because before the agencies didn't really have this definition or criterion to help guide their decision making. And so by having that automatically embedded, we can start to make more equitable decisions about various, where are we going to invest these funds? How are we going to invest it? What does that look like? Is it in the best interest of the community? And it also will bring on a environmental justice council. I like to call it an oversight board for accountability, to also make sure that when the agencies are following this new environmental justice definition, they're also doing it in an authentic and meaningful way. So that's one that we are so excited about, as I'm sure you can imagine.
Yes, that's great. And then the other one is about the stormwater
Yes.
and the sewage combination during storms. Do they have a warning when that happens?
There is no warning. In fact, if you have flooding in your home, there's only one hotline number to call. And we've recently started conversations with Seattle Public Utilities in King County to address this issue, understanding that flooding, this year we saw record, historic rainfall in the area, and we saw lots of flooding within community. And so, think about if you're just walking down the street and there's floodwaters there, which there are often, and you have a cut on your leg. But we also know that the river is also a Superfund site. So what happens if, you catch an infection or something goes wrong? So we think about calling attention proactively, like right now, to these the adverse health impacts of climate change. And that also includes air quality. And so I wish I had a better answer for you, but what I do know is that this is one where we look to the Department of Ecology and their, water toxics department, because once the EPA is done with the Superfund site cleanup, then the role kind of shifts over to Department of Ecology, because they oversee the stormwater runoff and mitigation. We also know that stormwater in the area is just a huge issue to begin with, as we've learned, for protecting, our orca species, our salmon species, and us too, right? So yeah, thank you. Wonderful questions.
I have one more.
Great.
Oh, well, Marty, this is going to be the last though, Marty.
All right.
I can be here all day. I will also put my contact information in the chat.
Yeah, but also, because really, you should become colleagues, because you're both working on so many things, so you should keep in touch.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you knew about the water bill in the federal legislature that deals with water infrastructure. But maybe I'll email you.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you again. I want to tell this to Adrienne particularly. You who have been here don't probably want to do this, but it was recorded and we will be able to access it through that on our website. And also there were 2 or 3 other things going on today after church, evidently. So I think many will be accessing this through the web. And thank you again, Adrienne. It was lovely. I learned a lot. I loved your pictures. I loved your slides. And I like the ones, particularly of the ones at the beginning of the Duwamish, how it used to be with curliness and, coming out. And then now it's all straight. And what I wish is that you don't have pictures for then, because there weren't any pictures. But I would love to see like a trip down the Duwamish in the old age when it was natural. And I bet it was so beautiful. And then you're struck with this, how totally ugly it is in most places now. So thank you again. So I'll turn it off if you don't
My
mind.
pleasure. Thank you for having me, everyone. And I hope everyone gets to soak up the sun later today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye. Thank you all. Bye-bye.